Good day. If you're constantly getting ghosted after your job interviews, chances are communication is not an advantage you have in these job interviews. And in today's day, I'm going to present you with 5 scenarios of candidates who communicate poorly in job interviews, oftentimes without realizing. The first scenario I'd like to present you here would be, let me ask you a simple question. If someone is unintelligible, does it mean they're not qualified for the role? And the honest answer is no. You could be perfectly qualified. You could even be a genius for the role that you're applying for. However, unless you can communicate this to your interviewer, they will perceive you as too much of a risk for them to take throughout the process. So this is why I would highly encourage you to take the time, maybe try to role play with someone, but build your ability to self-assess and become more intelligible during these job interviews, ideally to score well on clarity of thought. The second scenario I'd like to present you here would be, whenever I coach someone, whenever I role play with someone for the first time, I prefer to ask them a very simple and easy question, something on lines of tell me about yourself, or why are you interested in that role? And there's 2 things I listen carefully in their first answer. The first one is whether they read it from a script, and the second is whether they reworded it using AI. And you'll be surprised on the number of candidates who do this. Some of them even well-intentioned, going into these job interviews. Now, what I can tell you from the other side is that you grossly underestimate how this comes across to your interviewer. I've seen countless examples of candidates who didn't know why they were rejected from their job interviews when they thought their answers sounded great, only to hear, their answers were either scripted, they were reading them from a script, or they were rewarding them using AI. Okay, so in my experience, you should stay away from these strategies. Yes, there's people who can do this well, people who can do this professionally, even, news anchors, they read from the teleprompters, but this is not the objective. This is not a skill you want to build for job interviews. Okay. The third scenario I'd like to share with you here would be, you'll be surprised on the number of candidates who fail to answer the question they're asked. Okay, the most basic scenario is when you don't know how to answer it, but it could easily be something on the lines you don't understand the question, or simply you ramble too much to the extent that your interviewer will perceive you as not answering their question. Or some people simply fail to answer the question because they don't know how to answer it, right? For instance, a time when you had to deal with a conflict inside your team. If you ask this to an individual contributor role, many of these individual contributors will answer with something on lines, hey, yes, we had the conflict between 2 other colleagues, and I mediated that conflict, when in fact the expectation would be that you answer how you deal with conflict with other people, how you mediate those conflicts, right? And the way I know this is very common is because I sometimes advise directors and senior leaders not to answer the question they're asked, but rather to listen for the behavior the interviewer might be interested in. And whenever I tell them this, they tell me, hey Dan, but do you know the number one problem I have when I interview people in our organization is that they don't answer the question I'm asking them, right? Politicians can also do this quite well, not to answer the question. But again, this is not a skill you'd want to build for a job interview, okay? The fourth thing that I talk about here is oftentimes you might be perceived as a poor communicator because you cannot articulate your outcomes. Okay, if you think of the star answer, your results are not clearly articulated, ideally quantified, and this stems from the fact that you would overload your answer with the context. In other words, if you give a 5-minute answer, you'll spend the first 3 minutes talking about the challenge or the context or the situation, then maybe 1.5 minutes about the action, and only, maybe 20-30 seconds about the results. All right, so you should seriously consider focusing as much as possible, not only on clarity of thought, but articulating the parts in your answers which are the most relevant for them to hear. Okay, and the fifth thing I like to talk about here would be the nonverbal clues, some things such as a rapport or stuff such as cosmetics in general. What happens here is that it's normal especially for technical candidates, not to be able to build a great rapport with the interviewer in the beginning. And it's also normal for some candidates not to feel natural or not to feel right about maintaining eye contact with their interviewers. But what happens is that if you make a little bit of effort, not to build a great rapport, but to build a decent rapport, and not to make a permanent eye contact, but try to keep an eye contact every now and then, chances are your probability to read your interviewer will greatly improve. And what happens in job interviews, there's oftentimes ups and downs. And if you make a mistake, your interviewer might signal this to you. If you understand what they're saying, then you can get back on track. Or, if you say something that's to your advantage, if your interviewer is happy, and you see they're really happy about what you're saying, you could stress that, you could go on the longer side with your interview answer, score more points, bias them, and obtain a favorable recommendation. Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.